So hi everyone, thank you all for staying with us. It's been a long day of fascinating discussions. For those who were not here this morning, I will introduce myself again. I'm Julien Bellaiche. I'm the research director of GNet, and I have the pleasure to chair our last panel of the day, looking at a key element that allows us to do what we do, accessing and sharing primary data. Without primary data, we would not be able to say much about the communities we're investigating. So this panel will discuss access to data, data sharing, and multi-stakeholder cooperation in the field of online extremism, as well as the legal, ethical, and practical challenges related to such activities. So our goal here will be to identify key takeaways and directions for the future of extremism research. To talk to us today, we're lucky to have a fantastic panel of experts and a variety of different perspectives. With us today, we have Arda Gerkens. Arda is the chair of the Netherlands Authority for the Prevention of Online Terrorist Content and Child Sexual Abuse Material, ATKM, the Dutch regulator for communication services. With us as well, Alistair Pullar. Alistair is an online safety policy manager in Ofcom's online safety group, where he is the policy lead for online terrorism, hate, and incitement. We also have with us Skip Gilmour, the director of Trust and Safety Solution at the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, GIFCT. Skip managing strategy for GIFCT's hash sharing database and incident response framework. And finally, Harrison Pace, the project manager of the repository of extremist aligned documents, read a secure library of extremist material for professionals in the field of extremism. Welcome all, it's a pleasure to have you with us. We will open the panel to the audience for a few rounds of Q&A after the presentation. But first, let's begin with you. Harrison, ICSR, which has since become CSNS, the Center for Statecraft and National Security, has established READ in 2023 to provide professionals in the field with safe and secure access to far and extreme right primary source documents. READ has recently launched a new platform using DSpace, a professional repository software. So could you run us through this new platform and tell us more about the legal, but also the ethical challenges that you face implementing such a repository?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Julien, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? Do I need to lean forward a little bit more? Okay. So I want to start by stressing something which I think kind of frames the whole idea of collaboration beyond the practical aspect and sort of the outlook on collaboration as a concept. And I think that's the fact that everyone in this room, or whether you're online, we all have the same kind of mission here, right? In reducing both harms and containing movements that might create online harms. So as everyone who works in this space, we are working with and require access to various materials that do relate to these harms. But quite often we end up doing so in isolation, either from one another or from other pieces of this content, which might inform our understanding. So if someone doesn't have a particular institutional association, they might not be able to access material, or, we end up with informal or unintentional silos in research. And at the same time, a lot of the materials, when they do appear on social media, are taken down very quickly, which speaks to the great work of trust and safety teams. But it also means that as researchers, if you're not there to grab it at that moment, you might potentially lose something that becomes informative later on. So the challenge then isn't about whether or not the material exists, or whether or not we need to use it, because we know that to understand these movements, we need to understand what it is that they're producing and how they talk about it. The question is then how we can safely access and share this material in a responsible way. And I think that's where READ comes in. So if you aren't familiar, READ is the repository of extremist aligned documents. We are a special project based at the Centre for Statecraft and National Security here at King's College London, with additional support from GIFCT, to whom we're very grateful. The basic idea behind READ is quite simple. So we provide a secure and controlled repository of far-right extremist primary source material for those with a legitimate reason to access them. So that can include researchers, practitioners, law enforcement, civil society groups, anyone who kind of has a verifiable reason to access these materials, which I'll come on to a little bit later, how we sort of approach that. READ began in 2023 as a researcher-led initiative for sharing this kind of material. And a couple of months ago, as Julien mentioned, we launched a new version of the platform, which significantly expanded not only the repository size, but also the ways that users can search on the site. So there's now, you can use different combinations of metadata, so types of documents, authors, publishers. We've also added 26 category tags, which kind of identify ideology or particular topics which are being discussed. And over 90% of the material available out of the 2,400 documents are able to be searched using OCR, or optical character recognition, which means you can look for a particular keyword or phrase across that 90% of the corpus. And we are working on getting that missing 10% uploaded. So with the new site, as Julien mentioned, we're hosted on a professional purpose-built archival software, which also hosts university libraries and legal repositories. So it's really built for this kind of work. And having access to this infrastructure has been really, really important from both the management perspective, but also allowing these kind of user interface improvements that I've also mentioned. We've also recently expanded to including NVE, or nihilistic violent extremist content, because it reflects both trends that we're seeing in the space as we're doing our monitoring, but also kind of research interests of people that use the platform. And the reason I bring this up is because this diversification of threats and the emergence of new spaces is another challenge to kind of data sharing, because it means that naturally, as these new threats are emerging, people are studying them in isolation from one another. So making sure that we communicate as these new threats are emerging is going to be really important. So if we go back to the concept of collaboration, I think two kind of ethical points stand out from the perspective of READ. And the first is that we can kind of say READ itself performs a kind of ethical responsibility. And that's because people working in this field spend a lot of time exposing themselves to materials and ecosystems that are very harmful, either mentally or emotionally, or potentially kind of personal security risks. And so one of the things we want READ to do is to provide a safe and secure space for people to access those materials without having to expose themselves to these harms and risks. And there's been a lot of discussion, especially in recent years, within the space that we're all in, about these kind of risks and openness about discussing them. And that's really important. And so we think READ, we can potentially look at it as a way to avoid these risks while allowing people to carry out research and kind of reduce some of those barriers to entry. The second issue that we have is around access itself, because obviously a lot of these are sensitive materials. And while we want the platform there for those who need it, we have to draw a line somewhere, right? So I think that kind of gets to one of the tensions in extremism research in general, which is kind of this balance between transparency, access, and kind of responsible use, which is obviously a huge question that I don't have time to kind of get to now. But the long and short is that I think having a central or series of dedicated spaces where we can share these materials in a controlled way is going to be really important going forward. Whether or not that's at READ, I think that's something that's going to be really crucial. So then where we land on kind of this balance is a kind of qualified access. So making sure that people with a genuine need can do so, can access these materials, but only those who are approved on the platform. So in practice, that means we verify each user. We require an institutional email address, which indicates to us that someone is working within these kind of professional structures and has these structures of ethical practices in place. Or if a student is applying, we require a supervisor, a senior professor to approve their reason for access, to sort of verify that they are using this for their research and they're not just trying to have a look at these documents out of their own interest. So these kind of vetting processes have been written in line with guidance from various teams, including the legal team at King's College London. And I think this is something else that's going to be really crucial going forward and sort of working out the legal side of data sharing. So while our legal basis is grounded in the fact that this is for research and that we also have a closed access model, which, you know, helps us verify every individual user, many of these documents, like I said, are still sensitive, whether that's because they are propaganda by a certain group, whether that's because of imagery that they use. But it does mean that we have to be careful about how we go about providing access from a legal perspective. So one thing that we've been able to do with the new platform is that some of the more provocative or instructional documents that contain material that could be used to carry out an attack, essentially, We've redacted those sections which are instructional, and we've kept the ideological pieces, which, based on feedback from our users, is kind of the main reason that people use the platform. And I would say the one thing that had kind of a major influence on developing the legal and data protection policy for the new website is having access to these teams at King's College London. They've been a huge help the entire way through, both in terms of making sure that we're up to date with the legislation, but also aligned with best practice, especially around data governance, so going that extra mile. So Reed is hosted on secure data centers within the EU, and arrangements we've made with our service provider Atmire, who run the DSpace software. So the main takeaway from this perspective is that sustainable research infrastructure really requires access to quality legal advice and institutional support for these kind of projects to make sure that we have access to experts, not only in the field of extremism research, but also in legal and data protection fields where we don't have a clue. So there are also practical issues, which are a little bit less exciting day to day, but they're also equally important. So the job involves kind of identifying documents, verifying them, collecting metadata in a consistent way. And the biggest practical challenge to that is coming back to the nihilistic violent extremism and these diverse threats is simply keeping up with the speed at which these movements evolve. So, like I mentioned, documents can be taken down or deleted very quickly, but groups also move across platforms very quickly. And it's not always easy for us as a small team to track them. And that's where I think Reed has something to ask of people in this space. As I said at the start, everyone in the room or online has this shared interest in understanding and countering these movements, whether that's from a research perspective or a policy perspective. We're all kind of in this together, right? And Reed is free to use. Something that the new website allows us to do is to give individual users the privileges to submit documents to us so we can do the boring bit. We can fill out all the metadata. But basically the point is you can sign up with this QR code or on the web page behind me. If you use Reed or if you sign up to Reed and there's something missing that you have or you don't have it, you think there's something missing that we should have, please get in touch. Please let us know. We can work together on a way to get that material uploaded. So to summarize, the big takeaway here is that transparency access can and should go both ways. And we have to make sure to collaborate that we want collaborate to share data, which I think kind of goes without saying. And second is that this really does rely on institutional commitment and access to expertise. Like I mentioned, the legal and data protection teams at King's, that doesn't necessarily just apply to universities, but anywhere having access to experts, not just in the research side of things, but in the management side of things is really, really important. And the way that we've kind of resolved this is landing on qualified access as a way to make data transparent, but also remaining responsible. Thank you for listening. I'm happy to take any questions later. You can also speak to myself or our intern, Claire, over here. Please sign up to Reed. And again, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Harrison. I know how much work you put in this new platform. I really hope that Reed can contribute to break these silos and also offering a healthier pathway towards these documents for researchers. If you haven't already, please go and check it out. Register at reed.expert. Let me now turn to you, Skip. We've just heard about Reed, an initiative from researchers to share primary data with the broader community of professionals. GIFCT works directly with tech platforms and build tools to help member companies identify and share signals, but also processes to coordinate response in times of incident across members. Could you please elaborate on how GIFCT facilitate member companies' effort to disrupt violent extremist exploitation of their platform?
What a great question. Can you hear me? Right. Is it, am I doing the, okay, good. Okay, this is very important. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. And thank you, Julien, for the great question. I'm really excited to be able to be here today to chat, to kind of address the points that you just brought up. And also, I think just to really hit on some of the themes of the overall panel that we're here on, talking about data access. And I also want to really ingrain the idea that GIFCT, it's not that we have these tools that kind of sit in vacuums, like hash sharing and incident response. It's all one big ecosystem of information sharing and threat mitigation. And those in the room who maybe are not GIFCT member companies, maybe are GNet authors, perhaps are students, I want to really make sure that we're able to articulate in a very grounded and practical way how that ecosystem works, so that you can have a good understanding of how all the work comes together as one thing. So the first thing I want to point out is our hash sharing database. This is really the first tool that GIFCT introduced. The hash sharing database came about due to a need for very practical solutions to pressing problems that member platforms were seeing on their platform. There was a definite need to address the issues of ISIS and Al-Qaeda related content being shared across various platforms, member platforms. And as we see here in this very simplified diagram, as it stands before having something like the hash sharing database, what we have is a situation where a bad actor, a terrorist and violent extremist actor, uploads content to platform A and platform B. They are not in communication. They have to engage in their own vetting of the content to decide whether or not it's terrorist and violent extremist in nature, which there's some value to that. They have different policies, yes. But ultimately, this can look like a game of whack-a-mole when it is a situation of platforms just working independently without having that coordination element. So that is why it is very crucial that GIFCT did create the hash sharing database itself. I wanted to really get you the context of the database itself before diving into it, so you can understand essentially its need and what the need it is filling. So the hash sharing database is, as it sounds like, a database of hashes. These are hashes of terrorist and violent extremist content that have been flagged by member companies themselves during their moderation workflows. And for those who do not know, a hash is essentially, you can think of it as a digital fingerprint. It is a kind of alphanumeric representation of a piece of media. To be reductive, if you have hashing algorithm, whether that be MD5 or PDQ, you put a piece of media in, and out comes a bunch of numbers. Not really something you can reverse engineer, not something that's specifically useful to the human eye, but can be a good stand-in for the content itself. Because if I put a piece of content into an algorithm and then I put it in later, it's going to be the same number. So that is how companies can essentially share these hashes with each other after they find a piece of terrorist content, so that when there's a re-upload of the content, member platforms have access to this database to check against, so that they can stop the upload at point of upload. As you can see here, we have a few stats on the hash sharing database. At time of creation, the 2.3 million hashes with 408,000 distinct items in the hash sharing database. This can be kind of addressed by the idea that there are just different kinds of hashings that exist. So there might be multiple hashes for the same piece of content using a different algorithm. And as far as inclusion criteria, as I mentioned before, we understand that our platforms all have their own different policies for what they allow on their platform. What is appropriate for a platform that is maybe aimed at children might not be appropriate for a platform, or might be appropriate for a platform that is aimed at a more adult audience that's more discerning, where there is maybe more of this idea of being like a town square. So we have the inclusion parameters here just to give a good baseline of what is allowed to be in the hash sharing database, so that members have a good idea of what a match in that database is really going to mean. So as you can see here, we do use a combination of both a list and a behavioral type approach. So with the list, we of course use the United Nations terrorist 1267 list, which is mostly for ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates, as well as things that fall within our behavioral parameters, which you can see on our website, as well as perpetrator-produced content that emanates from our incident response framework, which I will be discussing in just a moment. So to really bring this out of the abstract and into something a little bit more concrete, I've got a few diagrams here I just want to quickly go over to give an idea of the hash sharing database, what it really looks like, so to speak, and how it works. So here you can see the hash sharing database is essentially just a centralized repository. The people who put in are GIFCT, ourselves, as well as our various members as they find content that meets the taxonomy criteria. Maybe they find a video of some sort of like ISIS propaganda or an execution, seeing that that is indeed related to ISIS, being able to put that in the database for others to potentially flag against. Now, this is very much at the macro level. Now, here's the micro level, and I'm not going to go into this whole diagram, which is why we have a QR code here to our annual transparency report, where you actually can see this full diagram and get into the nitty-gritty of it if you so choose. This is kind of a prototypical version of what the hash sharing use case is. Not every company is going to be set up the same way, but you will kind of understand the basics of what you might see from a moderation workflow using a hash sharing database. So as we can see here, we have step one. We're a GIFCT member company. We're saying member A sees a piece of content that is violative of their policy, is also in violation of the GIFCT's hash sharing database taxonomy. They hash that content. They put it into the database. So, and they're very happy with that. And then we have member two, which is where we get into the collaborative piece, who has a piece of content uploaded to their platform. They're able to immediately make a hash of that content, not necessarily for the purposes of putting it in the database, but to check against the database to see if that hash exists in that database, because if it does, it is the same piece of content. And from there, if there is that match, they can go ahead and escalate that to human review or however their moderation system works. Just to give you an idea, I like to think of it as like a conveyor belt type situation. And as I mentioned before, we have our transparency report, which we had on the screen just a moment ago. Another piece of information you can see within the transparency report is our incident response framework update, which is the second tool that I want to be able to discuss today. So as those of you might know, the incident response framework for GIFCT is our way of responding to offline terrorist and violent extremist events that have an online component. It's essentially a way of coordinating a response across all of our member platforms. This may look like hashing in certain situations. This may look like sharing of open source intelligence, and it may just be sharing of what we actually know and what we don't know, as well as what information is flowing in the ecosystem as information becomes available from primary sources. So in the new update, we have 3 different types of activations that are based on different operational workflows and scenarios that our members might see occurring on their platforms. So first, we have that perpetrator content incident. This is the type of activation that many who are familiar with GIFCT are probably most aware of. It mirrors the incident that was the real impetus for the creation of the incident response framework, which was, of course, the 2019 Christchurch, New Zealand mass shooting at 2 mosques, which was live streamed, which is why this is the perpetrator content incident. This is an incident where there is a piece of content that is disseminated as a part of the initial commission of the act, whether that is a live stream or perhaps a manifesto that is put out just before the attack takes place. This is a category that does involve hashing. So when this exists and this occurs and we activate for this, we are able to hash that perpetrator produced content, not necessarily the bystander content, right? And that is able to really have those 2 tools connect. Then we have our digital footprint incident, which is more geared towards investigation. This is for when we have incidents where perhaps there was no content produced, but the platforms were maybe used for planning or perhaps to create this kind of press kit, as we're seeing more and more from perpetrators, basically filling up a timeline of content that is almost acts as a secondary manifesto or aesthetic lookbook almost for what they're trying to get across. In these situations, there's no hashing, but we're able to do open source intelligence to flag content from members so that they're aware of what exists on their platform. As someone who's worked at a platform before, that's kind of the first question you're going to get when you see an attack in the real life, that even if you don't necessarily know there's a connection to your platform, your bosses are going to be asking you, did they have an account? And we want to be that nexus point to help you find that answer if it's not immediately apparent. And then, of course, we have our incident advisory, which is designed to be a very flexible framework, because more and more information is very contentious. There are definitely actors online who want to frame incidents as soon as they happen as being in their kind of ideological favor. So there's a lot of misinformation flying around. This is an activation that's for that situation when we don't have a clear picture of what the actual facts on the ground are, or perhaps it's an event that's occurring and unfolding in a manner that is not obviously time bound. Perhaps a piece of maybe terrorist activity occurring during a war zone or extended long armed conflict that might not be over in a short period of time. With that said, kind of moving on to some quick statistics that we have on the hash sharing database, just to highlight. Again, this is in the annual transparency report, so feel free to browse there. But it's just a very quick overview of the different hashes associated with the various incident response activations. As you can see, a lot of the largest chunks and percentages and pluralities are really some of those older activations. Now, what the incorrect take to get from this is the idea that there are a lot more hashes from the older events because perhaps that it shows the hashing working more before or a higher rate of production. But what we're actually seeing here is that companies are continuously adding to the database. Like, we're still getting Christchurch hashes added because people are continuing to modify the content in such a way that it requires a new hash for it. So that's why you're seeing the older activations obviously having more hashes. Everything will kind of catch up in time. So with that said, how does it all connect with the multi-stakeholder perspective? So firstly, it's really part of that knowledge production. GNet is a really influential and important part of what we do when we have an incident response activation. We are quite commonly reaching out to our colleagues in GNet to see, is there someone who knows about this, who can write an insight that is really going to be helpful for our members, as well as just general member resources. Through the working with GNet, through seeing some of the insights that are produced, we're able to get a good idea of who are experts in certain fields and certain spaces. So we do at times reach out to some of those GNet authors to commission additional member resources that are geared towards things that members are telling us are of concern to them. Additionally, we of course have our multi-stakeholder working groups, communities of practice. As Aaron mentioned previously, we had our gaming community of practice. Last year, we had our investigators community of practice. And in 2024, we had our hash sharing and our incident response working groups, which that input from those multi-stakeholder partners, people who are sitting on the panel now, people who are sitting in the audience, giving us actionable feedback that we can actually integrate into the updates for the IRF, for example, or the updates for the taxonomy for the hash sharing database inclusion parameter. So in a way, I'd like to think of the waters that the GIFCT tools are sitting in are really shaped by a lot of the research that is done here from a lot of the folks in this audience, even if they maybe don't necessarily see the everyday impacts of that. So I want to make sure that is all kind of put together in a nice package. So that said, that's my presentation. I'm happy to take questions at the end of the panel. Hope I didn't go too far over.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you for highlighting the importance of implementing that multi-stakeholder perspective, and also for highlighting how crucial it is to facilitate data sharing and cooperation across companies to efficiently tackle exploitation of online platform. Let's turn now to the policy side of things and the role the role regulators may play in regulated data access and sharing across stakeholders in the field. Arda, from the perspective of a regulator, especially in the context of the EU Digital Services Act, under which ATKM operates, what are the key challenges you see when it comes to access and sharing of terrorist and violent extremist content across stakeholders?
I can use that. Yeah.
I can give it a time.
Now it works. I know more about the internet than I do about these things, right? Okay, thank you very much for inviting me at this panel. My name is indeed Arda Gerkens. I am the president of the ATKM, which is a horrible Dutch name for my organization, thought of by the ministry. I would have done it otherwise. Let's just forget about it. What we're actually doing is executing two legislations. One is the Terrorist Content Online Regulation, which is European regulation, and one is Child Sex Abuse Material Regulation, which is national regulation, awaiting the European regulation to come. Now, the latter is maybe not that surprising to you, knowing that the Netherlands does host a lot of child sex abuse material, and we needed to step up. And so here comes the regulator. For those of you who don't know, I do believe there are students here, the Terrorist Content Online Regulation is a regulation that has been made to minimize the spreading of terrorist content online, obviously, after the Christchurch shooting. So Skip spoke about that, you know, one of the first live streamed attacks that you can see still a lot of material is still out there and being disseminated. And so we have this legislation, and we are basically a kind of odd regulator here because we solely are there for the prevention of the dissemination of content, which if you look at the DSA is there to kind of put the rules and regulation on how the platform should behave, but they're not telling them to take down several content, or just, you know, they have to prevent illegal content to be disseminated, but I'm not saying what is illegal content, and we are just telling them this is the content you need to take down. Now I have to correct you on something, because we are not a communication regulator, but this is very interesting, I think, to know that many European countries, unlike Ofcom, have a very diverse regulatory field. So there's several regulators who have in some way impact on the field we work on. For instance, we have a regulator for the GDPR, we have our regulator, we have the DSA regulator, we have the Commissariat for the Media. And so what we need to do is really work together here, because we have overlapping legislation and we have legislation that helps us together. So we feed the DSA regulator, and the DSA regulator also feeds us. It's very important to know we need to share information amongst each other and share this data. And so I'll give you one example, the coming of the notified tools. We came together, we all sat together and kind of figured out who can do what. And then we saw what the blanks are, and then we could advise our minister to make regulation on specifically that blank, so we can combat this kind of material better. And so we're also member of what we call the DSA chamber, in which all the regulators who are one way or the other connected to DSA regulation come together to be able to execute it in a good way. Now, what we do at ATKM is we assess material, terrorist content, specifically that, because that's what we're here about. We do this via detection. We get reports, so we get leads. And this is what we do. We then analyze the material, and then if we think it needs to be taken down, we send out removal orders, making us the only regulator in Europe who basically does the whole process from detecting the material, sending out removal orders, and even the appeal up until court, while the rest of Europe basically has law enforcement sending out removal requests. And if the request is not followed up on, they will then send it to a regulator, most of the time being Commissariat for the Media. I like this role, I'll tell you that, because it's much more, gives us much more possibilities as a regulator to oversee the whole field. We really need to know what's going on around there, because basically what we do is we want to work together with the platforms, with the industry, to combat this phenomenon. Because I truly want to believe that we share the same goal. We have the goal to keep an open and free online world where people can express themselves without harming others. And so the regulatory possibilities are much wider than law enforcement has. So we can initiate research, we can do this independent or collaborate with universities, as we do often. We also have initiated projects in the European Union to make sure that we harmonize the way that we act. So, you know, we can be predictable for platforms, which is nice. Nice if we all kind of act the same way. And we're also a member of GOSRN, the Global Online Safety Regulators Network, which Ofcom is also a member, in which we can work together with other regulators outside of Europe, sharing information over there, because this is not going to surprise you. We all speak about the same platforms. So for us, data is very important. It's very important because for the terrorist content online regulation, we need the data, first of all, for the input for detection. So a read platform where we have all this data or hashes can help us to detect the material online, to send out crawlers to kind of, you know, find the material, what we need to find it. So it gives us leads. It can help us identifying the material, but it can also, the research can also confirm that what we see is indeed something riskful. We talked today about nihilistic groups. And the fact that research sees the same threats as we see kind of confirms that we're doing the right thing. So we need that data in that way as well. But very important for us is we send out removal orders that need to hold up in court. We cannot just say, okay, this is terrorist content, please take it down. We need to justify all of our decisions. And this justification is very difficult. Especially, and it's mentioned here by Skip, many of the way that we analyze, is this terrorist groups on, are these terrorist groups or not? Are they, for instance, on the UN list? But then the UN sanction list is not made to identify terrorist online groups. It's made to make sure that you don't finance in one way these terrorist groups. So many groups are not there. For instance, activities from Breivik are not on the UN list. And still, I think we all agree that what Breivik did was an act of terror. So there are all kind of signals we need to take together. And what's, for instance, for us very important with the research is that the research kind of described in what role, for instance, manifests play, or what we saw today, the copycat writing on guns or things that can be used as a weapon, can all give signals to us that some activity like that might be a terrorist activity. So for us, it's very important to have that research linking those activities to terrorism. We also need research for independent monitoring. Of course, we can also monitor if what the platforms do to make sure that terrorist content is not being disseminated on their platforms is good or effective, but we're kind of biased in that. So we really like to have independent researchers telling us this platform has less material out there because they did this and this activity. And also, although I really like all the platforms out there, I don't believe everything they say. So I also like to have independent research telling me whether what they do, the tooling is being used in a way which is effective. Another way was, I think it was a beautiful example today, talk about GONCATs, on what happens when accounts are taken down. So this was very effective, right? So you can immediately see that there are less members of the new groups. So, okay, so that means that it's effective to take down an account. So we should focus on accounts instead of just one piece of content. All this information helps us do the right thing. So yes, we really need the data, and we don't need not just us. We know that all the members of GOSRN, all the Digital Service Act coordinators, they really need that data too, and they're looking for it. And so in the Digital Service Act, there is a special rule on the data sharing, and the very large platforms or the very large search engines, they have to give researchers access to their data. And a researcher needs to be a real researcher and just say, hey, I'm a researcher. So they have to get the status of official researcher, and they can get that via the regulator of the country where the platform is based. So the majority of the platforms in Europe are based in Ireland. The Irish regulator, Commission Domain, would be able to give you as a research the official status of researcher. And then you can ask for the data. However, we see in practice that it is still very hard to get that data from platforms. We hear platforms use GDPR as an excuse not to share it or any other excuses. And although regulators are doing their best to get that data, it's still, it's not a very good working process. And so what we see now is that researchers and scientists turn to us for data. They come to us for data to see where we have data on the platforms, how they react on our removal orders. And I would actually say, Julien, we gladly share that data, but I would actually call upon platforms, please don't let us give that data, because that data is always biased. It's less good data than you can provide yourself. So I would really hope that this process would be better in the future. Yeah, basically, this is what I'd like to say. You were also asking about the challenges that we see. So that's the GDPR. That's another thing we hear a lot from researchers that turn to us, that many universities, and I don't know about how that would be in the UK, but maybe Ofcom can speak a bit about that. Many universities in Europe are afraid to handle data as such because GDPR. Whilst, of course, I mean, you can very easily anonymize this data, and I don't think lots of it would fall under the GDPR, but that's something we see as well. And of course, the ethical side of it, that's a debate I hear also many times. This is data which is not illegal, but you don't want to be part of sharing that material, certainly not if you're a regulator who is combating the sharing. So that's another challenge that we see as well. So I hope I've answered your questions in this way.
Thank you very much, Arda, for sharing such an important perspective. And Arda mentioned the importance of research and researchers and access to data in ATKM's work. I know that in the UK, Ofcom began reflecting on how researchers could access information on online safety matters from regulated services. Alistair, could you tell us more about that work?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Pullar, working on Ofcom's online safety group as a policy manager, and I'm the policy lead for terrorism, hate and incitement. Just want to say I'm grateful to GNet and GIFCT this afternoon for the opportunity to talk about Ofcom's work in relation to information access for researchers. So I've got a short presentation, so I'm going to clarify what Ofcom's role is, our approach to delivering this report on researcher access, give a brief overview of the key findings, and talk about what work we've done since we published. So just very briefly, Ofcom's role is we're the UK's communications regulator. We regulate a number of markets, including postal, spectrum, broadband and TV. And obviously we're also the UK's online safety regulator. The Online Safety Act has been in place now for a couple of years. And we have a wide range of regulatory deliverables that we have completed either over the last year, and we still have quite a bit of work to do over the next year or so. And obviously I'm talking today about researcher access. As we've heard today, we've had a number of panels on really interesting kind of research trends and topics, and obviously through those panels, the importance of research access has been really prevalent and important. So we can all agree that greater research access gives us the opportunity to understand these harms, these threats in a more substantial manner. And obviously, selfishly, from a regulatory perspective, it gives us more information or evidence about what types of policy measures or mitigations work most appropriately for them. Yeah. Okay, so as I say, I'm going to cover Ofcom's role, background to our kind of regulatory duties and our approach to evidence gathering, the key findings of our report and the policy outcomes, and what's happened since we published our kind of next steps. So in relation to Ofcom's role, Section 162 of the Online Safety Act required Ofcom to publish a report about researcher access to information from regulated online services. This specifically required Ofcom to report on what the current landscape was, the current challenges or barriers to researcher access, and thirdly, how greater access might be achieved. We published a final report on this in July of last year. We originally began a consultation on this, I think, in October of 2024. We normally consult for about 3 months, so that would have meant the window would have closed in January of 2025. And we received, I think, approximately 39 responses to this consultation. We didn't only consult on this. We also held a number of bilateral meetings and several roundtables in order to kind of get the best evidence picture we could. And so that's what we did in relation to kind of our approach to this work. We were reasonably well placed to kind of lead this work, given our existing relationships under the Online Safety Act and our kind of regulatory activity. And this was central to enabling us to give us greater access and through our existing work with academics and researchers. We're an evidence-based regulator. So it's very important for us to kind of seek a wide range of views from relevant organisations. So this could be the Information Commissioner's Office, the UK Research and Innovation Council, etc. So that's what we did in relation to kind of our approach. So how do researchers currently access information? So our research indicated that, or our evidence indicated that there was 3 main routes for researchers to gather information about online safety matters. So the first one was through directly through services. So this is things such as API tools, voluntary research partnerships, published transparency reports from various different online services. And then moving secondly to indirect. So this is data indirectly from services. So this would be things such as data scraping, avatar research, either through ourselves or through kind of third parties. You have the ability to purchase data through brokers or intermediaries and different research forums. And then thirdly, you have the option of directly from users itself. So this would be things such as data donations, widgets, data trusts, or data cooperatives. The general view is that these methods can only reveal so much. They're often inadequate for meeting the full range of researcher needs. And as we're kind of well aware within this audience, this is against a backdrop of kind of scaling back of API access. For those API schemes that still remain, costs have risen significantly, or in some cases closed off entirely. And then more broadly within the European Union, Article 40 of the DSA creates new routes for researchers to access public and non-public data. And Arda has spoken very briefly about that within her presentation. So within our research, what barriers did we find which currently constrain information sharing? So there's a number of typical topics which I'll run through quickly. So from a legal and ethical perspective, UK data protection framework regulates all personal data, but researchers reported to us that there's perceived risks around public versus private data, and there are unclear boundaries from their perspective. Secondly, there was uncertainty and complexities of the data sharing agreements that are available. Thirdly, regulated services suggested to us that they faced a complicated legal and regulatory environment. From a security perspective, we need an environment that's fair to all parties, operating in a relatively low trust environment. Services constantly sought to cite security risk as a major constraint to offering data to researchers. In addition to this, public data inventories run risk of being exploited by bad actors, such as scams and things like that. And then in some cases, there's a risk of re-identification of users from anonymized data. From a financial perspective, the cost of APIs are prohibitive for a lot of smaller academic bodies. Secondly, the task of managing and storing large volumes of data and supporting infrastructure is quite expensive. Thirdly, services also highlighted development and maintenance costs. So these are things such as like server space, computing power, etc. And then from a technical perspective, there was issues around the standardization of data, interoperability, and lack of means to track how data is being used. Secondly, complex technical infrastructure required to ensure data is transferred in a secure manner that preserves privacy. This also required researchers to have their own specialist knowledge and skills in coding and data analytics. From an information quality perspective, there was a number of issues around information quality, which could make it challenging to reproduce comparative research. Some data obtained through APIs lacked important context or metadata for research. From an operational perspective, the process for obtaining data can be lengthy and complex, and this can exclude some non-academic or smaller research organisations. So how can greater access to information be achieved? Our evidence-based report laid out 3 options. So the first option was clarification of existing rules. So this is where relevant authorities could provide additional guidance on what is already legally permitted for researcher access on important issues such as data donations or research related scraping. There was quite a reoccurring theme in our evidence, which was perceived around the lack of clarity around the legal rules around data sharing. One option could be relevant authorities such as the ICO, which could produce additional guidance on what is already legally permitted for researcher access on important issues to assist in clarity. This would help researchers understand what data they can collect, and services would understand their own obligations. The second policy option was a direct access model. This would result in a new duty being placed on services requiring them to put in place systems and processes to operationalize data access. Services would be responsible for accrediting researchers and providing them data access directly to them via an interface. And this could take a form of a direct access model for which a backstop regulator could enforce these duties either through an existing or new body. And then the final policy option was managing of access via an independent intermediary body. So this body would accredit or verify researchers, specific data transfer methods, and resolve disputes between researchers and services. This job is left to kind of services and other models that we've seen. One of the main findings as well from our research is that all 3 policy options don't necessarily need to be used in isolation, and they could complement each other. There's no single model that's likely to meet the full needs of researchers. What's required is a layered, flexible approach combining legal clarity, technical safeguards, and independent oversight, which offers the best chance of enabling responsible, timely, and useful information access. So what happens next? So our report was published in July of 2025. That was us fulfilling our own kind of statutory duty under the Online Safety Act, and our report is being considered by the UK government. They have the provision under the Data Use and Access Act of 2025 to implement a new regime if they wish, and we stand ready to work collaboratively with them, academic research community and other relevant bodies where necessary, but the ball is very much in the court of the UK government. So any questions, what shape or form that regime would take would be ultimately for them. And as I say, we're ready to continue working with relevant partners and learning, particularly from international partners as well, where this is relevant. So very short and sweet presentation from my perspective, but I'm happy to take any questions on this and our kind of wider work. Thank you for your time.
Alistair, for this important direction. For the future, we still have time for a few questions. You were first. Yes.
Thanks so much to the panel. That was really fascinating. I'd like to direct my question to you, Alistair.
Sorry, we just need a mic so that the online can hear you.
I can shout. So you mentioned how you'd recently introduced to groups databases nihilistic violent extremist material. And so my question was, have you guys noticed any specific quirks with this type of material, given the lack of ideological grounding that characterizes this form of extremism? compared to, for example, far-right material?
Are we? Yeah. In terms of quirks in the material, some of it reads more kind of ideologically aligned with some of the far right stuff you might expect to see, and then some of it that's completely absent. The way in for us moving from far right materials to NVE stuff is that a lot of the NVE PDFs that we see contain imagery or iconography that's already associated with the far right. And so to some degree, we see kind of an overlap in this worship of far-right groups who they idolize because of their violent output, in particularly Nazi Germany and things like that. But in terms of the quirks of the content, I think there's much more of a focus on a lot of far-right groups want to maintain kind of a public image that to some degree is positive, so they might frame themselves as being a positive force for the white race, for example. Whereas some of these MVE, or most of these MVE groups, they kind of want to see the destruction of society as a whole. So they're not so bothered. They'll publicly kind of declare that they have a problem with everyone in society. They're very openly negative in their outlook. And I think that's probably the main difference that we see in that kind of material.
Hi, I'm Erin and I'm a researcher at Hope Not Hate. My question is for Skip. I'm fascinated by this hash sharing database. It's really interesting and a great tool. I'm interested into how does the database deal with like slight variations on a piece of content? Because obviously the nature of where things have gone with a lot of terrorist content is you have this kind of memification where things will be a slight change, or even just something as simple as it will be the same piece of content, but it will be cropped slightly differently or a slightly different colored filter. So I don't know, like, does that change the hash? Does it match in the same way?
Yeah. No, thank you for that question. You really hit on the piece that I was trying to skirt around having to explain. But with my very simple diagram, if I included this as in much. But you're right. It depends on the particular hashing algorithm that you're using. For very like standard, your basic, so to speak, hashes like MD5, we're talking exact match. Any change will cause a totally different hash that is not related to the other hash. So you can't even really do a fuzzy match. So there are other hash types like PDQ and PhotoDNA that are capable of doing fuzzy matching, where the difference between them can be measured and actually be, have certain thresholds to determine if this is likely the same piece of content or not. Not to geek out about it too much, but you can kind of think of it like this. If a standard MD5 hash takes a whole picture and turns it into a number, a lot of these perceptual hashes, what they're kind of doing is they're subdividing the whole picture like a grid, and it's taking a little hash of each of the little pieces, and it's determining how similar, how much of a match there is on the whole grid versus just the whole thing as a hash. So that's how it works. Does that make sense? Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for throwing that out there. I also do want to plug Hasher Matcher Action, which is something that our friends at Meta put out, which is an open source hashing algorithm for PDQ hashes, so you can do those fuzzy matches. And it also has the components in it to help platforms actually do the matching, because these perceptual hashes are, I don't want to say they're cutting edge, but they are not immediately obvious. There's a lot of tuning that has to go along with it. So one of like Hasher Matcher Action is a cool tool that a lot of members have gotten used to.
Hi, I'm Blythe. I'm from Moonshot. My question is also to Skip. I guess I'm just interested in how you've seen the hash matching change before and after the kind of boom of AI. And I guess the core of that question is basically, how does hash matching work when image generation and content generation can be done at extreme scale?
Yeah, Thank you for that. Thank you for that Thank you for that question. So as far as, I mean, I guess I joined GIFCT around the time of the big boom. So as far as what the big change was, the AI generated content and AI kind of augmented content has always been eligible for entry into the hashing database. So we kind of treat it similar to if you were to Photoshop something and putting filters on something, as long as it can be like determined to clearly be originating from that one piece. It is something that can go into the hashing database. So as far as like big changes, I haven't noticed a massive one. However, I think to a lot of the conversation that's been going on, your point of scale is the thing that is definitely very scary to me, because there are just more considerations that we have to consider. There's more things that we must consider. I think one thing in particular that kind of haunts me every incident activation now is, you know, when we first started looking at these manifestos, I could usually reasonably say, okay, the attack just happened. There's this 40-page document that talks about the attack. And you could think, no one can write 40 pages in a minute. That's not true anymore. So that's the kind of thing that we also need to kind of double check on, you know, basic attribution to confirm that we have like the digital footprint and user journey of this getting posted. So as far as like mass scale production, the database can certainly handle, you know, more and more hashes being entered for, you know, slight augmentations by AI, and they're able to be in there. But we want to make sure that we're not being duped, essentially, which takes, you know, some of the more, you know, I guess old-fashioned skills of doing the investigation.
Yes. We still have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, I'm JJ. I'm from the Home Office. Sorry, Skip. Got a question for you again. So we've done a lot of work recently tracing distribution pathways. I specifically work on Islamist terrorist propaganda. And this is anecdotal because this isn't at scale. But from a lot of the data that or a lot of the research that we've done in the days and weeks following a terrorist attack, let's say the 2nd of October Manchester synagogue attack last year, and I think it was Inspire Guide 11 that from Al Qaeda that was talking about that. We did an analysis on the distribution pathway, and we found that not only were there items on very large online platforms and mainstream platforms in the weeks after that were obscured, blurred logos, remixed by secondary or tertiary distributors, but also quite a lot of unobscured logos still on the platform. And anecdotally, I think we've seen that more in the last couple of years. I was wondering if that tallies with your experience and your thoughts as to why this might be.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the disclaimer up front, you know, the hashing database is a tool that can work on a lot of different use cases, but obviously it's not going to go with everything if things are not necessarily hashed. Sometimes I do, I mean, obviously I mentioned the perceptual hashes, which can get into the fuzzy matching. I often think of hashing generally as a pretty blunt instrument, like a deadbolt on a door. So we're looking at a lot of like wanting to have matching there. So does that match my experience? I mean, I can't know necessarily if a given piece of content that you might be seeing wherever you are is something that maybe has a match in the database, and for some reason something went wrong necessarily. But I do think what we're kind of getting into is some of the additional pieces that aren't necessarily covered by the hashing database, but would be like the kinds of things that I would like to continue working on with member platforms, particularly like you're mentioning, like logos existing, whether blurred or unblurred. I mean, there's additional technology that can be, I think hashing is probably not the best method for countering. Things like visual, like computer vision is probably a better way of actually tackling that, so that you can identify a logo that is anywhere in an image, whether or not that whole image has been hashed or not, right? Especially if it's just a small logo that's on like the side of over another image that's not hashed, you might not be able to catch it in like a perceptual matching, which is probably why we want to invest in some of this computer vision stuff. I've been experimenting a lot with like vector embeddings within, you know, different pieces of media that we have. But a lot of that stuff is still kind of in the prototyping, phase at this point. And I would love to work more with our members to see if there's a way that we could roll something like that out. But no promises. This is very much, in the playing around phases right now.
And it's cat and mouse game. I mean, it's really cat and mouse. They really do everything they can to avoid this detection, which we see actually with right extremist content more than jihadistic, but we see that change now too. So an AI plays a role there. So even if you would use the hash database, it's not the golden card to keep your platform clean. You need to have much more effort to combine it.
I am not going to ask a question of Skip. Actually, I was involved after September 11th in a lot of the terrorism lists in the United States, helping to develop them, and I was working on Capitol Hill. So anyway, I'm very sympathetic to the issues of lists, Arda. So this question is to you, though. If I were to take one big lesson away from today, at least for my own purposes, it would be that the traditional definition of terrorism does not match anything that, or at least a lot of what is evolving. The whole of panel 2 was all about how the lines are terribly blurred. We're really dealing with crime, cults, public health crises. It's not traditional terrorism as we would define it, which I think is fine. We don't all have to be academics, and we don't all have to have these, rigid frameworks. The problem is that the lists are defined according to specific definitions. And again, I sympathize, but the UN sanctions list is never going to be adequate to what we're facing now. So how can we even be using it anymore? Because it's not, you're never going to be preemptive or preventive. And so I would just ask you to expand on that. And let me just add one more thing, which is that the presentation that we had on the effectiveness of taking down platforms, I kept thinking to myself, well, you may be reducing the number of people who are using that platform, but if that number of people includes someone like, I don't know, Osama bin Laden, I mean, that would be far more important than if it was including 3,000 relatively unimportant actors or potential actors. So it's really, numbers don't really tell me what's effective. So I just was going to ask you to perhaps expand a little bit on that.
Time's running out. So well, we can talk after, because you asked the two most important questions. First of all, yeah, indeed, the definition of terrorism is made for acts in the offline world and not for the dynamics of the online world. And it's my true belief that we need to redefine it. We need to have more understanding. I think we have the understanding of the dynamics of the online world, but there's a lot of policymakers and even judges who do not understand, who hold freedom of speech. They evaluate it in how the offline world will do so, and not how freedom of speech now could accelerate and cause riots, as you have seen in your country, but New Zealand has had such an event as well. And it is a problem already for many of your terrorist activities are not being called terrorist act, but hate crimes and stuff like that. While we look upon it and we feel this is content that needs to be taken down, but it doesn't hold on, we can't put it against the definition of terrorism, which is a continuous debate within my organization with the ones who are setting out removal orders. We as a board always try to push them as much as we can, but then we have the legal advisors pushing us back. So yes, I am now starting this debate in the Netherlands, trying to at least, see, don't we have to look at terrorism in a different way online than we do as offline? Because we're not talking about criminal law, we're talking about taking down content. So we're talking about freedom of speech. Yes, we do. But it's not about criminal law. Nobody goes to jail for disseminating that image, which is different with child sexual abuse material. So that's one question. The other question was, remind me? The effectiveness, yes. This is also very interesting because we are now seeing in the Netherlands a phenomenon which I think we also see all through the world, is that we have a very swift radicalization of youth. And that swift radicalization is not only on nihilistic, violent and extremist content, but also a jihadism and right-wing extremism. And we see it with very young kids, 14 years old, right? So there's something happening over there. At this point, we are trying to see if we can have some focus group with young people to see what actually pathway are they taking. Because before they end up in these online groups, radicalizing them, there's happening something before that. And I've heard young people speaking to each other, oh, I don't have that beheading video. Could you just send it to me? And of course, I heard what you said, Aaron. There's a lot of research done on the effect of violent games and even movies. But also that I think we need to reevaluate what's the violent content online doing to the brains of youngsters. So I'm also starting with research on that. So, you know, this is the things that we can do as regulating. I don't have the answer, but I think what we do, we have to look where are we effective and how can we just disrupt that pathway at the point where it needs to be disrupted, evidence-based. And again, I didn't say it, but this is why I need to research. If you want to work with us, please reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I would be very interested, but there's a new world out there, and I really think we need to do more research to try to understand where we can be effective, and we need to shake up the people who think that the offline world is the same as the online, because it's not.
Thank you very much, Arda. Thank you very much, Arda. You don't want to scare anyone. Thank you very much, Arda. An important point to finish on. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, but it was a pleasure to have you all. Thank you for your insightful perspectives, and join me for a last round of applause for our panel.